Good morning, everybody. Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. Today we have I wanted to introduce it. This is like the second part of our series that the Equity and Justice group has been putting together about Christian nationalism. A lot of you were able to come back in June when Nick Bates was here. He preached and did a presentation, and that was pretty good. I think there was still a lot of interest, and we've been in communication with Dr. Perez for a few months now, and she even came to a couple of meetings with the Equity and Justice group, so she was very gracious to do that with us to discuss what we were talking about, and offered to come in today to talk with us some more about it. So to introduce her, Dr. Perez she's an associate professor at Classic and World Religions. That's where George is retired from, and also Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. She has a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Westmont College, a PhD in History of Science from Harvard University. She's been a fellow at the Darwin Correspondence Project in Cambridge and the Harvard Divinity School, and she's currently a fellow at Linda Hall Library for Science and Technology. I got it all from the website, so, so it's no lie. So what we're going to do is she has a few items to speak about from her own background and her studies and her perspective on Christian nationalism, and then we'll kind of open it up for questions.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to start by saying just how enormously grateful I am to have the chance to be here with you all. I've enjoyed so much the conversations I've had with the Equity and Justice group, and I'm so encouraged by this space of conversation. I often tell my students that when we are in a classroom together, it's a special kind of space for conversation, for conversations that are very difficult, that we struggle to find a vocabulary for. And to just get a glimpse of a church community that is trying to create spaces for hard conversations is something that I admire and that I'm grateful for. And I feel very honored and blessed that you've invited me into this conversation that you're having. And I think that my hope today is to offer you a little bit about what my perspective as a scholar, but also some of my life experiences might bring to your thinking individually or as a community about this. But my probably biggest goal is to open up conversations amongst all of you, but then also I would love to continue to be part of the discussion with you. So the handout that I've given you is things that are questions that you might think about together, that we might think about together here. I've included my email if there's something that really sparks for you and you want me to go on and on about it, but then also book recommendations. So I'm very honored to have this little bit of space and time to talk with you now, but I also hope it's an opening for more conversations. So what I want to do today is just talk a little bit about the history of three terms So Christian nationalism, evangelicalism, and the Christian right. And to sort of think about what these terms are and how history might be helpful for us in thinking about what each of these things are and how they relate to Christianity in a big sense, but also American Christianity specifically. And for me, when I do history, it's not about being the most right about a definition of a term. So my desire is not to tell you, as a historian, I know the definition of Christian nationalism. This is absolutely what it is, and this is what you think it should be. But what I do in all of my work is I use history as a way of reflecting on how ways of thinking, ways of being, sort of spiritual experiences in the world have come and have influenced us. So I would suggest that as a church community, if you are grappling with Christian nationalism in our politics or Christian nationalism in your life or your community, the task I would suggest is not how do we define Christian nationalism and then make sure that we're not doing it, right? That would kind of be nice, right? If we could get like a really clear, tidy definition of it, then we could say, okay, that's Christian nationalism, and then we'll go over here and make sure that we don't do it because we're worried about it. Instead, what I think that we have to grapple with is to recognize the ways and to sort of grapple with the history of Christian nationalism, what it is, and to see the ways that I would suggest we're all tempted into it as a mode of thinking, that it's a temptation that we all wrestle with, because the nation is something that is easy to make into an idol, that we are tempted into seeing the nation as the thing that will promise us security, the thing that will promise us that we can keep our families safe, that we will have the lives that we want. I was just saying after the service that the sermon today and the passage from Mark is something I think about often when I think about Christian nationalism, because nationalism in general promises to us that it's the nation that's going to guarantee our lives. And it's so, for me at least, it's so easy to be tempted into that. So what I want to do is tell you a little bit about what I think is helpful in using history to think about these three terms. And I come at it as Doug gave a very expansive introduction to my academic life. So I am a professor at OU. I came to Athens to be a professor in 2016. I came with my husband. We now have 2 small children. And I teach in religious studies and in gender studies. But I came out of actually history of science. So my kind of other expertise is the history of evolutionary theory and the history of genetics. And in general, what I do with my work is I use history to think about how science and religion influence people's intimate lives and their political lives. So there's a book I have that's coming out later this year that's part of that and relates to this, this topic really specifically. But I think of history as one of the kinds of tools that we have to open up our imaginations politically, to see something that maybe is hard for us to see otherwise. To see how something that seems intuitive or unproblematic might have this harder, more difficult history behind it. And so I tell my students, or when I'm speaking in places or when I'm writing, is that I don't really do history, again, to be right about the past, but I do it in order to open up my political imagination or to help others open up their political imaginations, or I would say even our spiritual imaginations. I also come at this as a historian, as a scholar of science and religion, of Christianity specifically, but I also come at this as somebody who has spent a great deal of time in faith communities. So I wasn't raised in the church, but I had a kind of dramatic conversion experience as a 14-year-old. I grew up 20 minutes from the border of Mexico in San Diego. I grew up as somebody mixed race and half Filipino, half white. I had this conversion experience at 14, and so I went looking for a church, and the church that I found was this, I didn't have the vocabulary for it at the time, but it was a mega church that was part of evangelicalism, part of the Christian right. The pastor who had it later sat on Trump's spiritual advisory council. He was a major person in the push to make an amendment in California banning, or make an amendment to define marriages between a man and a woman, Proposition 8. If you remember 2008. His name is, well, I won't say his name, but anyway, the pastor of that church, and he baptized me into the faith when I was 17. And after attending that church, I went to Westmont, which is an evangelical Christian liberal arts college. So my entry into the faith and my entry into Christianity was in this very intensive time of the rise of the evangelical right, of the Christian right. And in some sense, I realize now that I turn to history to kind of try to find a vocabulary for some of the experiences I had in those communities. And that although I no longer identify as an evangelical specifically, that I still have very deep ties and connections to those communities. So I also, I think, come at some of these questions with a sense of kind of resonance and empathy. So all of that to say is, when I talk about these things in a scholarly space or a university space, I don't usually explicitly talk about them as a person of faith, although I usually do share with my students that I am. It's sort of my, I think, way of encouraging political transparency. But I think that, this space for me feels very special to ask ourselves, what does it mean as people of faith to reckon with what Christian nationalism is, which is some of what I think that is in a moment, and can we envision a Christianity in the United States without it? And I think I would suggest, I think that's harder than we would hope. I think it's a harder, more difficult task than we would hope. Okay, so that's sort of me and where I'm coming from. So I'll start with telling you what I think of as Christian nationalism. And for me, it's a belief that, it goes two ways. It's the belief that the nation is the vehicle for bringing about God's will in the world. That the political entity of the nation is what makes God's will, God's kingdom on earth come to fruition. So it kind of goes in that direction. But the other direction that it goes is the belief that the nation succeeds when God favors it. So there's this intimate tie between the nation and God. The nation does well if God favors it, and the nation is the place that makes what God wants to happen in the world come about. So you can have Christian nationalism in lots of places other than the United States. There's many examples we can think of now or in history where this vision of the nation and God's will and power are really tightly intertwined. But the United States has a really, really special and really intense history with Christian nationalism. So from before the founding of the United States, so one of the spiritual communities that was enormously influential in the early theologies of what became the United States, the Puritans, who came from England believing that they were setting up a new, purer version of the Protestant faith. They were really explicit in their view of what they were coming to make in the New World, and then later what became, when those English colonies became the United States. They were really explicit in their view that there was something special about this place, that God wanted these English people to come and create communities that would be his kind of saving work on earth. And we can see, and lots of scholars have looked at that from the earliest days of the founding of the United States, over and over again, there's this language of the United States as the inheritor of God's covenant. There's a lot of language of the United States as the new Israel, that the United States is a special place, that it's the city on the hill, that it is the place that is going to bring about God's salvific work in the world, even to the point of the second coming, that the United States has this kind of special place. And one of the things that we see is that after the United States was founded in those first 13 original colonies on the eastern seaboard, is as subsequent generations were making arguments about the need for the United States to get bigger, so for the United States to expand, over and over again they invoke this argument that God has something special in store for the United States. It's God's will that the United States grow larger, take up more territory. And there's really specific moments in the history of the United States. So, for instance, the Mexican-American War in the 1840s, which took over a bunch of the territories that are now like Texas and Arizona and parts of Southern California, New Mexico, that area. But then the Spanish-American War, which is the 1890s, when the U.S. becomes an overseas empire. So when the U.S. Took colonial holding over the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Cuba. And in that period, this idea, which is probably, as you've heard of, manifest destiny, was this very prominent argument invoked by many pastors, some priests, but then also political leaders, that God desires the United States to be larger. God desires the United States to take over territories from native peoples, from other nations, because the United States has a special role, again, in God's kingdom. So one of the basic things I would suggest is that we owe, in many ways, the very physicality, the territory that our nation covers, to this idea that God has something special for the United States. So I would say, sort of regardless of our political affiliation or the kind of church that we go to, I think that if we are Christians in the United States, we have to reckon with that the United States itself as a nation was created and forged by Christian nationalism. And I think that's something that all people in the United States should need to reckon with. And I think it's something that Christians have a kind of deep reckoning with, right? That in some sense our question is, how do we regard the nation if we see that the nation was made in violence, in genocide, in forcible war because of this belief that God had something special for the United States, that God would help the United States in its wars to cover more territory and control more things because of this kind of view of Christian nationalism. So for me, that's in really broad strokes, when I think big picture of what Christian nationalism is, I think of it as existing kind of before the United States as a nation, part of what helps the United States become a nation, and then what helps the United States expand. When we start moving towards the present, that's when I start thinking about, okay, what's the role of a word like evangelicalism? What's evangelicalism in relationship to this? And then what is the Christian right in relationship to this? So I'll take evangelicalism first. So one kind of way so evangelicalism is a word that's very familiar. I think we all have intuitions about it. We sort of have a sense of what it might mean. My students, again, even if they don't have a lot of religious literacy, they sort of feel like they know. They're like, I know what evangelicalism is, basically. And there can be kind of two ways that we can talk about what evangelicalism is in terms of a movement in American Christianity specifically. So one kind of way that people have thought and talked about it is they think and talk about it as a theological movement or a movement of religious experience. So if you think about it in this way, historians who talk about it in this way will usually date the evangelical movement to the early 19th century, at a time, especially in denominations like Methodism or Wesleyanism, where there's certain kinds of orientations to the Bible, orientations to worship that arise at that time, and then are sort of features of the movement after that. And so some of these things are like emphasis on close readings of the scripture, emphasis of kind of intensive experiences of God. The big one is the emphasis on spreading the news, so to evangelize, so spreading the news, that's where the movement gets its name. So when we think about evangelicalism as a kind of theological or religious experience movement, then we think about it as like, well, it's this movement that's existed since the early 19th century and has certain kinds of features of the way that Christians want to experience it, often Christians who wanted a kind of more like dynamic, intensive, personal faith. The other kind of way that people, especially in recent decades that scholars have started to think and talk about evangelicalism, is to say, yes, it does have these theological and kind of experience aspects to it, but it also has a really distinctive political framework that it has had, particularly in the 20th century. And here, when people talk about evangelicalism as a political movement, it's a movement within American Christianity that has been and continues to be concerned that America is losing the influence of Christianity, that America is becoming too secular, that what Christians need to be doing is to bring Christianity into more spaces and ensure that Christianity continues to have power politically in our political systems, or power in our school systems, or power in our media, for instance. So when we look at what I would call the kind of political movement of evangelicalism from the early 20th century, the thing that I see it being characterized with is this continual concern that America is becoming too secular. And so then there's this interest in bringing, for instance, Christianity into the teaching of views of Christianity in public schools and science classrooms. So the creationist movement is a big part of this. That's a lot of the kind of thing I study. But then also things like sex education, that's a big part of the movement. The concern about the Supreme Court decision that banned prayer in schools. You see the movement, for instance, to get the term under God inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance, right? So it's this movement that is saying, oh, America is losing its distinctive Christian identity, it's losing the influence of Christianity. And what we need to be doing is ensuring that we're putting Christianity kind of back into power. So one of some of the initial, the two first sources on the list that I gave you are by this prominent historian of evangelicalism of this generation, Matthew Sutton. And he has his book, American Apocalypse, I think is a fantastic history of the evangelical movement. And he just recently released this article. It's very, he released it. It's very, I had a very nerdy moment where I was like, I can't believe Matt is saying this. I'm so interested in this, But where he's making a very strong argument in that article that we need to think about evangelicalism as a political movement in the United States and less as a theological movement. And we have arguments about that, but I think there's, in my own history and historical work, I think there's a lot to that. So, as I said, a lot of what I studied, especially for the book I have that's coming out this year, was that interest that different Christian communities had in assuring that Christianity had the political influence they wanted in different kind of political and social settings. And one of the things that you see sort of from the early 20th century, let's say through the 60s and 70s, is there's a lot of effort by what we can define as evangelical communities to do this. Like I said, see creationism as part of this. There's the development of organizations like Concerned Women for America that are pushing against, let's say, the women's rights movement. There's a lot of concern about the gay rights movement starting in the 70s. And so you see these kind of political efforts across these evangelical communities. But what you don't see through the 70s is an affiliation with a specific political party. So they're very interested in being involved in politics, but they're not necessarily seeing one of the major political parties, either the Democrats or the Republicans, as like the place to go for. And where this really changes, sort of dramatically, is in the 1980 election when Ronald Reagan comes to power. So one of my favorite histories about this is Daniel K. Williams' book, which I put on the sheet, God's Own Party. And he does a really amazing job of narrating out of the archive how this happened, where you have evangelical organizations, think tanks, again, being developed in the 1970s, and they have Jimmy Carter as their president, who is still evangelical. He was part of the evangelical community, but they were these various political movements, some of which I agree with him, is that what you see in that moment is that evangelicalism continues to be a political movement, but it becomes a partisan political movement, and then it remains so to this day. So, and it increases, and we can get into some of the details of why that partisanship increases. But for me, that's when I see the rise of the sort of formation and the rise of what we call the Christian right. That the Christian right is this political, religious movement that has these really deep histories, right? This really deep history in Christian nationalism, this deeper history in the evangelical movement in the 20th century. But that what the Christian right is a vision that all of those political aims, that view that Christianity should be influencing the nation and that the nation is the best securing of God's will in the world, that all of that should happen through the mechanisms of the Republican Party. And so what you see from 1980 onwards is that, on the one hand, this really influences the Republican Party. So many of the things that the evangelical movement cared about, so its concerns of pushing back against the women's rights movement, its concerns about gay rights movement, its interest in promoting creationism, its interest in pushing back abortion access or inhibiting abortion access, that all of those things start to become part of the official Republican Party platform from then on. So evangelicals moving their partisanship of their politics influences the Republican Party, but I would suggest, and people have said this, it also goes the other way. so that the sort of especially the elites in the evangelical movement saw that having a seat at the table within the Republican Party becomes so important to their vision of what they want to make happen that sometimes arguments are made that there could be these sort of compromises that we might make. That it doesn't really matter if the president is an evangelical. What matters is that we have the seat at the table. And I would suggest that's really what you saw going on with Donald Trump in the 2016 election. You know, many commentators, I remember at that time saying, like, well, he's not even an evangelical. You know, why are they supporting them? And I felt like it didn't recognize that it was a very savvy kind of political perspective to say, well, we don't need the president to be a faithful person. We need to be at the table, at power. So when I think about, you know, my own kind of life experiences really in the Christian right. So, you know, I was, as I told you, later I realized I was baptized into the faith essentially by the Christian right. It's sort of, I mean, we can talk about how I like reckon with that individually, but sort of like, you know, what is the sort of reckoning with this as a community or as a faith community? I think that one of the things I think that could be really easy is just to try to distance oneself, right? Well, that isn't me. I don't believe that's Christianity. I don't think that that's like what we should be doing. You know, especially, I mentioned that I'm mixed race. I grew up very close to the border in San Diego. Conversations about immigration and racism about immigration were certainly part of my growing up, and they only increased after September 11th. I would say that the racism that was part of the evangelical movement, that sort of was like subtext for a few decades, really became the forefront of the movement during Barack Obama's presidency, and then I would say with Trump. You know, I think that I think that for myself as somebody who, again, because of my racial identity, because of my scholarship, I think that one kind of thing I could try to do, again, is just to say, well, I don't think that's really Christianity, right? I don't think that's really people following the gospel. I don't think that should be what we're doing. And so that just, you know, I'm not a part of that. And I think instead what I feel called to reckoning with, again, is to say, well, what in my life am I tempted into? Like, how can I recognize that racism is a temptation that I have, that Christian nationalism is a temptation that I have, that these are things that we are tempted into because we are continually tempted into finding a way to control our lives, to have power of our lives, to be the ones who say what our story will be, to be the ones who can ensure that all that we love and hold dear, we have the power over that and not God. And so I think as hard as it is to say, I think that I feel called to a sense of almost empathy or a desire to kind of see myself in a way in the Christian nationalist movement, because I don't want to, I guess, commit the mistake of thinking that I am pure of heart and that I'm above that, right? And so for me, one of the places that I've thought to go to instead is to, instead of distancing, is what I think of as, and I take this from kind of Buddhist practices more, is these practices of deep listening, right? These practices of deep listening to communities that you don't agree with, to communities that challenge you. And one of the places of deep listening that I've done, probably for the last decade, is to listen to Christians from communities that have been the most oppressed, the most violated by Christian nationalism, and to sort of hear from them and listen to them. Not to speak for them, or not to be the person who says this is the answer necessarily, but to sort of to see what it is that I can learn from this. So the place that I've listened to probably for the longest are Black theologians and Black religious studies scholars. And to think about, as I confront this history of and reckoning with the temptations of racism, what are the things that I learned from listening to those people who have, in their own lives or in their community's lives, been the most violated by the structures of American Christianity and Christian nationalism. So on the sheet, I just included two of the texts that I thought about, particularly in the last, I would say like kind of 5+ years, one of whom I think may be familiar to people. So Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited. I don't know if people know this book. So are people familiar with Howard Thurman? So Howard Thurman, I won't go on too much, but I think that if you were to read one other book in your life, before you die, I think this should be the book that you read.
Say the name of it again then.
It's the first one there. Oh no, the second one, Howard Thurman, Jesus and the Disinherited. Yeah. So Howard Thurman was a Black theologian in the early 20th century of the United States. He grew up in the Jim Crow South in Florida, became educated at Howard University, moved to Boston, and he was the first Black chaplain at Boston University in the 20th century. He was also a mentor of Martin Luther King Jr., and a lot of people who study King's approach to Christian nonviolence really point to Thurman's theology as one of the framings and inspirations for that. And Thurman opens up, it's not a very long book, but he opens up Jesus and the Disinherited by relating this conversation he had with an Indian man. And the Indian man asks him, how can you still be a Christian? Christianity is the religion of the colonizers, of the enslavers. Like, how can you be a Christian? And he just has a set of extraordinary meditations on that question that don't sidestep it, that don't set it aside, that don't try to make it explain it and make it all okay. But the vision that he has of being called into what it really looks like to love your enemy when your enemy has stood on your head, when your enemy has prevented you from eating at lunch counters or drinking at water fountains or being educated, when your enemy has done violence to the children and women of your community, and what it looks like to love your enemy out of that. And he says that, in that book, he says, when so much violence is done to you, you believe that hatred is the thing that's going to keep you alive. Hatred feels like the thing that reminds you that you're human, that gives you energy. But he says, hatred, once you unleash it, you cannot control it. And you think you're directing it at your enemy, but it actually eats you. Mm-hmm. And what the gospel calls us into is the only form of life, which is to love our enemy. Mm-hmm. And I read that book in grad school, and I just, I read it again probably every year, but I think, if Howard Thurman, who coming out of the Jim Crow South in Florida, can say that, what can I be called into by listening to that? So that's one theological text that I have sat with for a long time. The other much more academic text that I've sat with is Jane Cameron Carter's book, Race, a Theological Account. And Carter is a professor at Indiana University. He's a Black theologian, Black religious studies speaker. And he does something in that book that I think is very helpful and also challenging, which is to ask us to really reckon with forms of Christian theology in its deepest history. So he goes all the way back to the early church to think about what are the kind of almost theological illnesses that the church is tempted into that lead to racial thinking and racism later on in its history. And he talks a lot specifically about the struggles in the early church over Jewishness and the place of Jews in the Christian community. And he talks about the way that the Christian community tried to sort of shut Jewishness out of Christianity through a kind of form of othering. And he starts with that premise and says, how can we kind of go back into almost these theological mistakes that the church would made to think about God's plan as a racial plan, right? That God's coming for people was to define them as a group of people by how they look or the way they talk or what they eat, rather than this vision of God really coming for all people. So I wouldn't, that one's like this big, so, I think it's a wonderful book, but if you're going to read one of them, I would say Howard Thurman. So that's all to say, I think that when I think about, why have I spent this time in my life, sitting in archives, poring over archives, writing history, reading historians, I think for me that it's to have a chance to offer to my students or people who read my work or places that I speak. Sometimes I speak to religious communities, sometimes I speak to medical communities or doctors or scientists, and it's to say that we need lots of tools to kind of help us get out of these forms of thinking that we have that oppress us or oppress others. And I have just found history to be one of the most illuminating ways to that, but I don't think it's the only one necessarily. So what I hope to do, just sort of briefly here, is to offer you a little bit about what I've learned from history, what I think doing and being history can offer, and maybe to open up for all of you a little bit of contemplating of the role that Christian nationalism has played in your own histories, and how we might kind of reckon with that together. Okay?
Well, thank you for this kind of recent history, but I think it's very important for us all to realize that the story of a religious nationalism is in the book of Joshua in the Old Testament. In other words, there's plenty of precedent, not just 200 or so years, but 2,000 years of a religious blessing of people who take over other countries. And it's certainly a lot that motivates Gaza's trauma today. So this is nothing new. And the people in the Christian evangelical tradition are too much Old Testament Christians. I've heard a Baptist preacher put it that way, and boy, is it ever true. Because if you read 90% of the Old Testament, it is for us taking over the world and redeeming it. Yes, the young people can join us, but we are in charge because we have the God that knows the world and has made the world. And that mentality gets you right into the present circumstance for the evangelicals. They read their Bible. They know that God wants them to take over the world. So I think that we need to keep that in mind and not be bibliolatry. That is, not to worship the Bible, because some of the Old Testament, in fact a great deal of it, is background reading for the language of the New Testament, which, as you say, is a complete denial of any national religious identity.
Yeah, I think, thank you so much for that, George. I appreciate it. I think that, I think you put maybe more clearly some of what I was saying when I was talking about Carter. In some ways, what Carter is saying is that if we envision ourselves as like the replacement for the Jewish people in God's religious blessing, then we will sort of make the error of thinking that what Christians are the new ethnic group that God has blessed. He used to bless the Jewish people, and now he's blessing the Christian people. And that what the New Testament offers is a vision that isn't tied to a particular nation. And so Carter argues that Christians, even in the early church, made that mistake, and they continue to make that mistake of kind of misinterpreting what the gospel was. That's putting his very complicated, lovely argument in like very simple terms. But yeah, thank you so much for that, George. I think Doug maybe wanted to turn to some questions and conversation.
I have a question about the indigenous people in the United States, which occupied our whole country.
Yeah.
Period. That's my question.
Yeah, it is in many ways the question, and I'm glad that you put so fine a point on it. When I was talking about, that we owe the fact of our nation to the forcible resettlement, genocide of the indigenous people, I think that we have to ask the question, like, is it possible to have a nation without nationalism? Like, how far does our criticism of the nation need to go in order to be faithful Christians? And I think that sometimes I think that I don't know if we will live outside of that violence until Jesus comes home. One book I didn't put on the list. Sorry, I'm like a book recommendation machine. Is Tisa Wenger has a book. She's a religious studies scholar at Yale Divinity School. She has a book called Religious Freedom. contested history of an American ideal. And she makes a really, I think, forceful and persuasive argument that our understandings of what, and when I say our, I mean American understandings of what religious freedom are premised on, especially the colonial relationship with indigenous people. And a lot of her work has been about understanding what America reckons with as religion in relationship to the colonialism of Native peoples on the continent, but then also the overseas American empire. Yeah.
What was her last name?
Wenger, Wenger.
I probably need I don't probably need a mic, but.
Oh, it's kind of a rule here.
I'm highly Flora Voss. I grew up in this church until I was 15, and then I divided ways with my mother and went to the Assemblies of God, and called myself an evangelical until 2016. And this is my husband, Bruce. And I wanted to, what you're talking about is so incredible for us because we've come out of this world, but been deeply inside. And I think I taught that pastor that you mentioned, son in the 5th grade. But what I wanted to say is that I've seen things happen in waves in the evangelical church that are not all negative. In the 90s, I was living back in the Jim Crow South of East Texas where my dad grew up, and in a town that where the schools were not integrated until 1972. Which I think Brown versus Board of Education required it in 1953, okay? Took that long. And I was living in that town, and the pastor of the church that I was going to, very evangelical, felt strongly that he was being called to know and connect with the other pastors in the town, and he was leading with repentance, and he would go to another pastor and say, I repent that I have not known you, and then if they were of another race, that we have been divided racially or denominationally or whatever, and they would say, we just want to hear what is happening, what's your vision, what's your hopes and dreams, and then they would pray together and go and take them to lunch. And eventually there was a group of 25 or 30 pastors who were coming around, and they were all, economic levels were extreme. From the pastor who had the $1 million stained glass window to the pastor whose glass was all taped up with duct tape and rickety folding chairs. And this was a real, true racial reconciliation, but also it was an amazing thing to be a part of. And women were participating. And then they invited this evangelical historian from Texas to come and speak to them after doing this beautiful foot washing of racial reconciliation and everything. And he basically preached to them to become a Republican. And it backfired so bad, it was like an explosion in that town. It was after I had already left and was married to Bruce, but and the white people couldn't understand why that had happened. This is a perfect example, is that when your answer becomes politics, then you've lost your religion.
Thank you so much for that story. There's so much that's rich there. And I think one thing I'll say is that I was sort of making that contrast in my talk about thinking about evangelicalism as a movement of theology and religious experience and then thinking about it politically. And I think that can be helpful sort of for clarity, right? Because when people use the word evangelical, and they often mean a certain kind of style of church worship. They mean that it is, not affiliated with a denomination, so kind of institutionally and financially it functions quite, these churches, you all know, they function quite differently than the Lutheran Church, for instance. But these things aren't totally unconnected from each other. And, the movement of, let's say, Pentecostalism in the 20th century, or like the Jesus Freak movement, for instance, right? This like movement of wanting a form of Christianity that felt very immediate, that was intensive, and I talked about, I came into the faith in this spaces, right? Like the form of worship that I experienced when I was first a part of the Christian faith was a very like intensive, kind of charismatic form of faith. When I was at Westmont, I went to chapel 3 times a week, and then I would go to church, and then I would also go to like another worship service, like on Sundays, right? Where it was like I didn't have enough, I needed more of this. So I think that this sort of recognition or the excitement that faith can be something that is immediate, that is personal. It isn't just something you do on Sunday. It isn't just something that's sort of about being like nice and polite and you're going through the motions, but that it like takes over the whole of your life. That is very connected to them thinking like, well, if my faith is supposed to be taking over the whole of my life, well, shouldn't it take over my political life, right? Like, shouldn't it take over like who I am as a teacher, or who I am as a voter, or who I am as, a neighbor? And so that I guess I have like, I have empathy for that, right? When you think about, I want like to be, we often have this language like we want to be fired up for God, right? Like we want like a movement for God's people in this world. And so then the idea that, especially if you have, trusted faith leaders telling you like, well, the way that you're going to make that happen is through ensuring these people get into power and that they pass this kind of legislation. I think all of that makes a lot of sense to me. I'm going to recommend another book, sorry. So the other book I'm going to recommend is a book called When God Talks Back by Tanya Luhrmann. Her last name is Luhrmann. And she's an anthropologist of religion, and she did a close ethnographic study of the Vineyard Vines churches, which is kind of it's like I don't want to use the word franchise, that's not the right word, but there's like a set of evangelical churches. It's like a strain, I guess I can't think of the right word. But she does this with these and it's very uncanny to read if you've ever been an evangelical, but she studied how the kind of daily habits and worship experiences, but also forms of prayer that help to cultivate in evangelical communities this intensively close experience with God. And so she talks about how that happens. And I feel like if you have ever had experiences in the evangelical church, it's like an uncanny thing to read in Paul just talking about it. But if you haven't, I think it's also kind of an empathetic window into what the daily patterns of life are like in that mode of understanding your faith. That kind of intensive, very, God is with you at all moments kind of thing. Yeah.
I do need the mic, thank you. Hold on. Okay, so I was moved to talk about a couple of things since your last statement and everything else, which has been very interesting. Thank you very much. But my sister came into the Jesus Freak movement in high school, and I was off in college, and this whole thing was just creepy weird to me. I didn't get it at all. In any case, it really divided our family for a long time. I won't delve into all the details of that, but it was very difficult. In any case, as I think that one of the things that really struck me was that not just because this is right for me, I should do politics, because this is right for me, and I'm so happy with this, that everybody should have this joy that I feel. And, I can sort of get that. That sort of makes sense. Except as I tried to explain to my sister, I'm just not you. I cannot, no matter, I don't know if it's some genetic thing or whatever, but I can't do that. I have a whole arm of my family on both sides that have that kind of, whatever, zeal, and a whole other realm that go, I'm trying to be a nice person, but I don't get that. So there's that. But I also wanted to say that my sister has evolved over time, and she is now, a pastor and a full-time professor in a seminary, and has written books. And as part of all this, she has become a very strong advocate for women's rights. And because she has been, outspoken evangelical for many decades now, she is the perfect person to talk about these issues to those, let's just say, power-hungry, male-dominated parts of certain religions that would normally not listen to her. And she knows the Bible, and she can quote the Bible. She's completing a book on the women in the Bible and the strong women in the Bible. And she's also become embarrassed by the term evangelical and doesn't want to talk about herself as an evangelical because it has become such a stereotype that's really ugly in many people's minds. And that's really sad. And so she wants to be clear that there is an emerging group of evangelicals who don't really like to talk about themselves that way, that really want to look for the power of what the Bible really says, and that, being kind and generous to all. And she is the most giving, generous person I've ever known to everybody, whoever they are, from wherever they are, and will listen to anybody and really cares about those things. So I get really annoyed when I hear people say, oh, those horrible evangelicals, blah, blah, blah. I said, like anything else, we should not be painting any group with a broad brush. We need to listen to the fact that there's a lot of different kinds of good people and bad people and whatever, and that we all, as you were saying, which I really like, that we all have to recognize our historical biases as a culture. And we need to be cognizant, and I think this is part of the sin thing that we talk about in church. Let's recognize when that sin of feeling that you are so much better that you can power over everybody else takes over. And it can be in subtle ways that are hard to describe until somebody points them out to you. So anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you very much. Doug, you can pass it along.
Oh, and I'll just say briefly, thank you so much for that. I'll say briefly two things, which is, I'm so glad that you highlighted that, and I emphasized in my own personal history that I was, came into evangelicalism through the Christian right. And then I went to an evangelical college, which is a really different kind of space in evangelicalism, right? And I absolutely loved it, and I still love it, and that community is still a daily part of my life. I have 4 friends from that community that I talk to on a daily basis, and I think of them and my time there as really forming my still spiritual and moral center. And one of the things that has been interesting to me with this particular group of friends is to see, sort of as we've all gone through our own journeys, like which of us feel called to doing the kind, doing closer to what you're saying that your sister is doing, and feeling like, I had one professor at Westmont who described herself, she was a French Huguenot, so I feel like she knew a lot about this, but she described herself as like the loyal opposition, right? Like you stay in the place with loyalty to change it. And so I have dear friends who that is their orientation to evangelicalism. And I felt like that wasn't my own individual calling, right? And I think a lot about, it's a passage in Ephesians about the body of Christ where we can all be different parts of the body. I think about that all the time about, I don't know, I guess I'm an elbow instead of a wrist, right? And so, or whatever it is. And so I felt called to this, but I feel like in communion with that calling, right? And so to see, we don't all have to do precisely the same thing, but that we can see each other and be in communion with one another for this work. The only other thing I'll say is that I'd be so interested to know specifically if your sister knows some of what I wrote about in my book that's on the sheet, is the history of evangelical feminism and evangelicals in the 70s who were starting to call for they talked about they wanted women's equality in church and home and society. And one of the main reactions to that was the formation of the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, which is the council turned by John Piper that developed complementarian theology, and they wrote lots of books making these anti-feminist arguments. But they also do things like put out these statements that churches will adopt. So one of the early ones was the Danvers Statement. One of the most recent ones is the Nashville Statement. And so there'll be these statements almost always on like issues of gender and sexuality. The Nashville Statement is a lot about trans identities and bodies. And so that organization will sort of almost like create, like, this is what we're arguing that the Bible says about, let's say, trans persons. And then evangelical churches will then like affiliate themselves with that statement. So I think that work kind of within that language of what does Scripture really say about these things is so powerful. And so powerful, I think like it's such a powerful thing that there's this powerful reaction to it, right? That still like has these effects. So yeah.
Just based on that, I want to comment. Carol Keir probably could speak to this pretty well. The evangelicals also have come out strongly, some for care of creation, earth justice, recognizing climate change and the need to do things. But my question is regarding the 7 mountains or 7 pillars of Christianity. Has that been like a strong, true theological underpinning of the Christian or evangelical movement all along, or is that something that's been exploited for political power?
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I've heard this in reading, some of the books like Tim Albert. So the 7 aspects or 7 mountains: family, religion, education, media, arts and entertainment, business, government. That Christians are supposed to be in control of all of those, and that's part of what this right-wing movement is doing right now.
Yeah, so you're asking, like, does it have a theological basis? Does it have a theological basis or not? Is that your question?
Does it, or is it?
I mean, I think the thing that I would say is, like, descriptively, you don't see that as, like, a theological framework before, like, the 20th century in the United States. That, I don't know if it's precisely the same list, but one of the places that I see an early version of that is in Jerry Falwell had this like very famous sermon series in the late 70s called Listen Up America, or Listen America, I don't know if there's not in it. And he identifies very similar, I don't think he calls them mountains, but he calls them these like areas that Christians don't see sort of need to be in charge of. I'm not a trained theologian, but my kind of, I would say that I don't think of that as a reflection of like the deep history of Christian theology, but I do see it as something that I've seen in the history of evangelicalism, particularly in these conversations, especially after World War II. And in part, interestingly, in response to the Holocaust, these conversations that there's this worry that it's secularism that was the cause of the Holocaust, that it's secularism that is the cause of violence. So one evangelical theologian who I point to who makes those arguments is Francis Schaeffer, who started L'Abri, which was this evangelical commune retreat in Switzerland. And he was one of the first evangelical thinkers in grappling with the Holocaust to make this argument that the Holocaust was possible because of secularism, that the West had lost Christianity, and that's what made that possible. And so what Christians need to do is put Christianity back into Western civilization, so something like that couldn't happen again. So I think I've often looked at like Schaeffer's move there theologically, not doing the specific pillars, but it's kind of the logic underneath it, right? It's like, how could something this awful have happened? And his argument was because we lost Christianity. I can go more into that. I have like a lot of thoughts about the Schaeffers. I'm also good friends with the Schaeffer family, so there's a lot going on there. But I think that's like what's going on with that.
I just had a question about, where do you see the future of Christian nationalism going? Do you think that it'll become more emboldened, or do you see a breaking point, a large, maybe, I don't know, reckoning and dealing with religious trauma? I don't know. Just maybe interested in your personal thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's such a wonderful question. So yeah, I think the first thing I would say is that it like even in my own life experience, it has like become so much older than I thought I could have imagined, you know, in the early 2000s or even in the 2010s. I remember even when I was first starting to I had a postdoc at Rice University from 2014 to 2016, and I remember then it was a feminist studies postdoc, and I remember in conversations I was having with other feminist theorists where I was like, I really, you know, they were very interested in criticizing liberalism, and I was like, I think sure, but I also think like, you know, the conservative religious right is like a real political power. I think you should pay attention to this. And they're like surely not. Like, how much power could it have? And then I'm like, I wasn't happy to be right because, like, you know. And then 2016 happened. I've had some conversations with those people since then, and they're like, oh yeah, that was like it. They were just like, it seems like this small side thing that isn't a big deal, and like it'll go away. And I was like, I don't know. I feel like it's not going anywhere. So that's a kind of comical way of saying that. I felt like, you know, up until the 2016 election, I felt like I had to do a lot of work when I was teaching or when I was making scholarly arguments to get people to see that the Christian right was thinking and talking about race, and that there was racism in the Christian right. That's like not an argument that is like hard to make now, you know, because it was like kind of, it was there, but you had to kind of look for it and you had to kind of read for it. Now it's just like, you know, it's like the headliner of what's happening. So I feel like it's become more emboldened, and I mean, I think it could go as tragic as we can imagine, right? I mean, yeah, I think it could be as bad as we could imagine. I don't know that there's a reason to be assured that it couldn't. And of course, I, you know, have and hopes and desires that it isn't. And you know, when I think about moments of hope that I have, I mean, this kind of space is a moment of hope for me. Some of the moments I've had recently is to see more and more evangelical voices kind of coming out to say, you know, we're not arguing you should vote for Democrats, but like we need to like release ourselves from the tyranny of this relationship. Like we cannot possibly be faithful people if we see ourselves as like always adhered to this one party and this one man, right? And that is a space of hope for me. But yeah, I think it has gotten a lot worse than I imagined it could have, and I think it could get even worse. Yeah. I don't know if that's like a cheerful Sunday morning thing, but it's just be honest about it. Yeah.
At the beginning, you were saying essentially something that I always say that, you know, I think people raise their eyebrows, but I would say this country was founded on greed and selfishness, right? People came and took other people's stuff, killed them, whatever they had to do. And as you said, all used religion for it. And so Christian nationalism really has hijacked Christianity in the same way. When you look at, for example, that video where I think he was one of the authors of Project 2025, but he was speaking to someone who he thought was a kindred spirit. The conversation started with a prayer. Mm-hmm. And what is, you know, all of that all about? Again, it's about greed, right? It's about controlling other people so you could have your way. And part of your way is making money while you're doing that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, you know, you're telling people all kinds of nonsense about, you know, your son comes home from school as a daughter and all of these things. But when you look at it, it's about money. And then you control, I guess there is that urge of greed in all of us. So the people that you're controlling, they're not really getting anything. You're actually squeezing them. But then you're telling them, well, those other people will come and take your stuff. And so, it's all built on greed, with religion as this shield. And so I think it's going to be around for a long time because the people who are propagating this have something to gain from it. It kind of feels like a cult, and cults in a very sad way. My thing is, if for some reason people wake up from a cult, I hope that the rest of us don't suffer for it. But I think it's going to be around for a long time because of the people who are propagating this. They have a lot financially gained.
No, I agree so much, and I love the way that you're using the language of greed and selfishness. I sometimes talk with my students that I think that the world's ills are spiritual ills, right? That, when we think about like the deep sin that the creation of the United States is in itself, like how do we reckon with that? Is it a political solution? Is this about activism? Is this about, reparations, or like what is it that we do? And for myself, I think these are all like tools with which to reckon with this, but that it like comes from ultimately, I think, like spiritual ills that are like within each of us, but then kind of within us collectively. I sometimes ask myself, because of the scholarship that I do, I'm very conversant and engaged with a lot of leftist activism. Like I've written about, I've spent a lot of time in the archives of a lot of leftist radical political groups, many of which I take a lot of political inspiration from. And sometimes as I've asked myself, I think it's a good question to ask, is like, why am I still a Christian, right? Like, why didn't I think that, kind of like brown radical power was like the way to fix the problems of the world? Why didn't I think that, like decolonialism, is a word people use, is like the way to fix things? And I'm very politically inspired by those movements. And I also think that the desire to have control of your life and also to have more and to amass more is like a spiritual illness that each of us can wrestle with. And I don't think there's like any specific political system that cures that. I think that, for me at least, Christianity is a way of reckoning with that I don't fully get from politics itself. At least that's the way that I think about it. I also, back to the question about Indigenous people, this isn't really a joke, but my husband is he's an environmental science, and he studies sustainability, and so he's often trying to help companies like make more sustainable choices. And we sort of have this joke in our house where I tell him that there are only imperfect decisions in an inherently violent world until Jesus comes home. And I really do think that. I think, right? It's like you do what you can in a world that is violent and not really get an excuse for the violence until Jesus comes home. That's like how I think about it. No, you should say that quite that way in class, but maybe I should.
I wanted to sort of ask about the economic aspect of this. I feel like there's a sort of unique American tradition of the prosperity gospel, this glorification of wealth, and that sort of manifests politically in opposition to like welfare policies, because that's supposed to be what we do, not the state, but us or the state. And so I wanted to ask about how that connects to Christian nationalism, where they draw that commitment to wealth and capitalism more broadly.
Oh, that's such a fantastic question. So I'll answer it one way by highlighting two of the books I put on the list. So I put Kevin Cruise's One Nation Under God. I think the subtitle is sort of like How Corporate America Makes Christian America. And then I think Morton is her last name, maybe it's Bethany, To Serve God in Walmart. And both of those books look at 20th century and thinking about the role that corporations specifically as entities played in the shaping of American Christianity, American Christian experiences. To Serve God in Walmart is a really fascinating look at the ways in which the Walton family drew upon Christianity in the formation of their business, but also the way that they treated their workers in creating kind of hierarchies between their workers, but then also the ways that Walmart kind of became a space of like spiritual formation for people. So that's a way of answering your question, that economics and capitalism, I think, are absolutely back to Pat's point, that like they're really, I think, at the heart of the story of one of, I think, the manifestations of political power, material power, is economic capitalism. And, you know, the vision that America is blessed by God, one of the blessings is its wealth, right? If we are blessed, if we are blessed by God, it shows in our wealth, right? It shows in this like capacity that we have. And I think that the way in which that encourages this like disdain for the poor in American Christianity, I think we see over and over again of a disregard and a disdain for the poor.
Contempt.
Yeah, a contempt for the poor, absolutely. Or I think in the way that maybe it wasn't narrated to me that in all these evangelical churches, but this sort of sense of like, well, that's our role as the church, to give charity, not to have systemic like welfare policies, for instance, which is, I think, better than contempt, but is a very different vision again of, it's sort of interesting. I mean, I don't mean this so critically, but it's sort of interesting that you could argue that it's important for Christianity to influence like school curriculum, but it's not important for Christianity to like provide for the poor through the government, right? So I think that there's probably room for reflection within the community of like, why is that, right? Like, why should Christianity like be in the school, but Christianity like shouldn't be in the food bank? I don't know. Yeah.
I know it's getting to be time to wrap up, but I just hope this conversation can continue, number one. Number two, I was part of a conservative congregation for several years, and it was important to me because I really wanted to examine my Christian faith. I was part of a community that was very satirical about religion as a liberal in New York City in those years, and I felt if I want to return to Christianity, I should go to where it is the most important thing in people's lives. Yeah. And I tried to be open-minded. I don't know that I was all the way to the royal opposition, but there were things that were meaningful to me there. And so that's been an important part of my own journey, and things that I thought were very valuable that I did think mainstream churches ignored. And I could see that. And I see that even in the lives of my brothers who are conservative Christians, but whose ability to be sacrificial in their marriages has been a real blessing for them, just as an example. But what I want to just ask you about is what I think we're saying, but not just coming right out and saying it, is that there's Christian nationalism that is being viewed, that is partly a force coming from forces that aren't Christian at all, and wouldn't really, even some pretend to be, who are manipulating people's fears, and doing that so successfully. And that's what I'm struggling to understand, the vulnerability of the people who you have empathy for, and you explain to us all the reasons. What is their vulnerability to the rhetoric, to the ideology that has taken them over? And in the conservative congregation, one of the evangelicals I was exposed to is Beth Moore. It has been very important to me because she has not stayed with that group, but she's been excommunicated, as best I understand. So the liberation of women who has, a very honest kind of Christian devotion, I think is an issue. But here's something I never hear about. What are they saying about us? This is what I don't understand. How are we being demonized? How is the opposition being demonized, and how is that powerful? Could you just say a word about that?
Yeah.
I mean, I'll just give an example. What's his name? The Attorney General for Barr. Okay, Barr was being interviewed on one of the liberal TV stations, and he confessed to all the things that the interviewer was saying about Trump. And at the end of the interview, the person said, "So who are you going to vote for?" And he said, "Trump." And this person was just like, "What? How can you say that?" after agreeing with me. And I'm like, would you answer the question? Why are you voting for Trump? Because you think he's better than the alternative. What do you think the alternative is? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Yeah.
What do they think the alternative is? Thank you.
So, I know we've been going on for a while, so I'll try to be succinct. It's such a big question. So I would say that in my experience observing it and also in the archive, what I would say I would point to three things especially. So one thing I would point to in terms of talking about like mainline denominations, for instance, I see it as a very common kind of narrative arc. Like, oh, I grew up in a mainline church, but my faith wasn't really personal to me. I just went through the motions. And then I had some kind of conversion moment. And then I realized that I needed my faith to be more intensive, more personal, not cynical. And so then I had to come to this kind of a church. I think you see that a lot. And there's more to go into that, but I think there's that. The second thing I would point to is, and you see this, for instance, in like the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood language, is that things like feminism, the gay rights movement, that these are movements of the world and that they have a demonic origin. And so that people who are allowing themselves to be influenced by them, so churches that have like gender equity and churches who ordain gay priesthood, all of this is because they have allowed the world and the forces of evil and Satan himself to influence what is happening. That these things are not biblical and that they're of the world. And they, so there's a kind of picture of like a liberal mainline church as spiritually dead, and then the picture of I'm not saying anything like this, I'm just telling you what I'm and then a liberal mainline church as like taken over by the forces of evil. Then the third thing I would say is that one of the places I think that you can really see this all coming together is around the issue of abortion. And I mentioned Francis Schaeffer earlier, and the thing that Francis Schaeffer argued, and it was a new theological argument, is his argument was that the fact of abortion being legalized in the United States and other parts of the West was one of the clearest signs that the West had walked away from Christianity. And he was one of the first Christian people to say that abortion is a sign that a society has abandoned God. And it was his theology plus some of the work of his son, who he's written about. His son's name is Frank. Schaeffer has written about this in his memoir, for instance, called Crazy for God, where they took this kind of theological idea and in that kind of 79, 80 period, promoted it to evangelical churches just as the Christian right was forming politically. And so this idea that like abortion is the issue on which evangelicals need to be most politically committed to because it is the strongest sign that a church or a nation or a community has left God. That all kind of comes together in that moment. So for instance, like before the late 1970s, the Southern Baptist Convention was not anti-abortion access. Like I always tell my students, like if you could go back in time and find what you would now call an evangelical church in like the late 1960s, you ask them about abortion, their response would be like, we don't really talk about it. They probably hadn't thought about it. When Schaeffer and his son did this kind of like barnstorm of a bunch of evangelical churches and colleges trying to make this, like they were making this case that abortion needed to be this issue for evangelicals. A lot of evangelicals were like, that's a Catholic thing, we're not going to touch it, or they're like, this is kind of scandalous, we've never said the word abortion in their church. And so they like couldn't get into a lot of evangelical churches. They got into a lot of them, but it just like wasn't an issue at that time. So that's a long way of saying, I think that those like broad things I was saying about, individually as a community, we want a faith that is intensive and that we're committed to. And then there's this really key moment politically where abortion becomes almost like a focal point for all of that. And now I would argue that, you have a generation and a half at least of people who are in evangelical churches that it's not like you have a memory of that moment exactly, right? It's just, it has been this like necessary touchstone of proving your faith. And other things become this, like gender roles become this, like stances to abort or immigration become part of this, but abortion in particular, I think, like becomes this thing of we cannot possibly allow legal access to abortion because it means we have fully abandoned God as a nation. I think it's like the vision of. I don't know if that's a good place.
Maybe if you could just say a few words about, because one of the questions we have a lot, or in our discussions, is how do we respond to family and friends who are espousing Christian nationalism? You mentioned like a deep listening or something like that, or what's a few suggestions you might have for that?
Yeah, that's such a, I mean, don't do what I've done, which is like give people a list of books to read. I mean, I do think, one of the frameworks of deep listening is that you listen without forming a response in your mind, that you're just listening and you listen for a long time. So that's a place that I start, right? It's like that I'm listening without thinking about how it is that I'm going to respond. And you asked me your response, but but I think for me, like beginning in that place, and sometimes it's a long time, to feel like you really hear like where a person or where a community is at. And so I think it depends on like what your relationship to the person is, like what kind of time you have, what kind of spaces are possible. That's why I like to talk so much about special spaces, right? Special spaces for conversation. But so I think, for instance, I've had really close friends who, for instance, are like, I just really feel like this way of voting is really necessary, but I also, I feel uncertain, I don't know, and they're communicating to me when I listen to them for a long time that they feel like they need more vocabulary, they're not sure, then I might recommend a book, right? That's not the only thing I do, but I think if it's a person who is like, you are of the devil because you support gay rights, for instance, that's a really long listening. That's a really long listening. Where is that, like, that is, as religious scholars would say, that's a sincerely held belief. And I don't think that having, like a point-by-point set of refutations for that, I at least haven't found that that's the way to go. So I guess the thing I would say is I like to feel that if someone feels, I guess, open to different ideas than the ones that they have, I like to feel like I have things to offer. But if they're not, then and I have had the experience, not just in religious spaces, but I have had the experience where I've like offered history to people and I have really strong reactions from them, and then I'm like, this was an offering that I have, but I'm not saying you have to think that. I say that to my students a lot. I use that word where I tell them, like, I'm offering this history to you. I'm not disciplining you into agreeing with this. I'm not saying you have to think the way that I do. This is my offering for you then to go away and do with it what you might want to. And I think it works. I don't know. We'll see. Yeah. All right.
Well, thank you again.
I think your comment about vulnerability really struck me because it's very hard for me to understand why people would vote for Trump if they're a Christian. So that vulnerability, I would like to explore more. What is creating that vulnerability? That they're willing to listen to lies, to believe in lies, to, they seem to want to. What is causing that vulnerability?
Well, I wanted to announce a couple of things that might help with that. I mean, it's kind of along those lines. One of them, there's a book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory. Some of us from the group have read it already. And who's the author again? Tim Albert. Yeah, okay. And it's highly recommended. And it kind of gives a background of the movement from the inside, just like Dr. Perez gave us. There's also two movies, Bad Faith and God and Country. They're available on Netflix or Prime. I put them in an article in last month's newsletter. So.
I started to watch Bad Faith, but I turned it off.
yeah, you kind of have to make sure you're in the right place to watch them. So, and thanks again, Myrna, for coming and working with our group on this. And we hope to see you around more often. And congratulations on your book that's coming out. So, and thank you all for coming and for listening and good discussion.
Doug.
Yes.
What's the movies called? Bad Faith and...
Oh. Oh, yeah.